And the learning from me was debt may necessarily not always be a bad thing. So I've been in the industry of life insurance now for the last 22 years, just completed 22 years. And I remember in about 20 years ago, or maybe 17 or 18 years ago, I got introduced to this gentleman by the name Ahmed. And Ahmed's from the Indian subcontinent. He was an up-and-coming entrepreneur at the time. Over the last 17 to 18 years, Ahmed's business has had a transformational journey. He's multiplied his business 10 times over, at least a couple of times. Ahmed at the time had 3 children, and his biggest want or need in life was to be able to transfer that business to his children, or his dream that he saw as an entrepreneur from the subcontinent was to hand over the reins of the business to his children eventually. But what also changed along the way were his almost like a reality check on what his children really wanted. One thing he realized is as his children were more educated in Western schools and were put in premium schools and colleges, their need to come back to a business which was more raw with fabrication and metals and labor and everything else was really not there. Ahmed over the years has realized that he can't have that pressure on the children either to have them want to take on the business. And with conversations with him over the last few years, he's come to realize as well that what he wanted truly was the benefit of the profit and the cash flow of the business that he created to be transferred to his family, not necessarily the business itself. So one thing that he also decided to consider was potentially bringing in a business partner or to even sell the business. Selling the business was something which was very difficult for him to do for various reasons. The main thing being an emotional attachment to something that he created from scratch. So the other alternative for him was to then get the business financed. And his banks constantly had conversations with him just because of the positive nature of his cash flow and the way he ran his operations. They constantly came back to him with offers of financing the business. He, for most of his life, said no to it because he already ran a relatively debt-free business and didn't see the need to have to take on debt when the business was flourishing. The only switch in his mindset took place when he realized he could essentially take a loan against his business or finance his business, move the cash out of that business, almost thinking of the bank as an investor in his business, moving his equity and his capital out, and purchasing other assets with that money. So essentially, if you think about it, let's assume his business is worth $30 million US, and he got financed about $15 million US on the whole thing. $15 million of equity is his money in the business. $15 million is what he owes the bank. Now he's responsible to pay off $15 million back to the bank, which is being generated from the cash flow of his business on a yearly basis. But he takes that $15 million US from his business and he parks it in assets elsewhere in the world, which are generating him another income, whether this is rental property, whether this is equities. This could be positions he holds with banks that gives his family dividends. What he's done now is he's ensured that in the event something happens to him, those $15 million US and the cash flow that comes from that basically gives him the right amount of money or gives his family the right amount of money to ensure that they're taken care of. And the interesting thing that happened thereafter is Ahmed started looking at all of his other assets that he owns. One of Ahmed's key assets in the UAE is the property that he currently lives in. The property is estimated to be a value of about 40 million dirhams. When he first purchased it a few years ago, when it first came to market, he ended up paying 8 million dirhams to purchase the property. And over a period of time, he paid off that money in full to the developer, took possession of his property, as he, as a person, generally dislikes debt. After having the financing done for his business, Ahmed realized the other big problem or the other chunky asset that he holds on to in the UAE is his property, which at the peak of the markets was valued at about 40 million dirhams, close to about $12 million US. And this is a conversation that he went back to his banks with to see if the property could be refinanced. Luckily for him, they were in a position to refinance up to 75% of that value of the property. So he got $9 million in finance. The questions that you need to ask yourself over here, the obvious one is, did he need it? He absolutely did not need the finance for the purposes of financing. because the property was free of debt, he didn't require any cash flow. So then the question is, what was the reason to go ahead and finance a property that is fully paid for already? The reason to do that was, again, to circumvent the Sharia law, was to ensure that the assets or the value of the assets were passed down to his next of kin, in this case, his 4 children and his wife, in the manner that he chose, rather than leaving it to chance, leaving it to law, leaving it to religion, leaving it to factors beyond his control. So the reason to purchase a life insurance policy and then assign it to the bank for the $9 million of debt was predominantly to ensure that in the event he passed away, the bank would now get its payment of $9 million owed to them by the life insurance company. That $9 million that he's taken as a loan from the bank is already parked elsewhere, maybe even gifted to his next of kin. And the real equity in his property today is about $3 million US. Over the last few years, Ahmed has done this at least 2 times with the same property. As and when he cleared more debt, he took on more debt. The purpose behind the debt was to ensure that the money, the equity, was moved out. Now, if a succession planning problem took place, which had to do with division of the assets, it would be only on the equity portion of his assets versus on the debt, which was already moved out and parked in assets elsewhere. Honestly, I learned a lot from this case study myself over the years, because I saw him start his business, I saw him thrive in his business, I saw him sell his business eventually, start another business, build it to this level. And the learning from me was debt may necessarily not always be a bad thing. So the reason that Ahmed has chosen to take on debt over the years now is because his key motive behind all of this was to create assets that can ensure that his family are financially safe and taken care of in the future. The purpose behind taking on the debt is to ensure that that transfer of wealth takes place now in bankable assets while he's alive, rather than have his family deal with the issues around succession planning that may come upon his death. I'm going to end this by telling you 2 reasons why property debt can be beneficial for you, or even debt on business can be good for you. Of course, one part of it has to do with the creation of wealth. When you take on debt on your assets, on your property, on your business, and you park that money in assets that can earn you a parallel income stream or can have capital appreciation, to secure that debt, in most cases, you need to offer some form of a collateral. That collateral is usually in the form of a life insurance policy. By nature of purchasing a life insurance policy, you've now increased your asset value because the debt is parked elsewhere, you've got equity sitting over there, and now you've got the additional life insurance cover. So you could, in theory, have raised your asset value by 40, 50, 60, 70%, or whatever was the financed value of your asset. Another reason to consider taking on more debt on business and on property is to mitigate any potential for inheritance taxes and to create a more streamlined method of transferring assets from one generation to the next.